Hello, my name is Ilya Nikolic, and I'm a research assistant at the Center for European Studies, Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Carleton University. This interview is part of the European Union Policy video series, and today I'll be speaking with Miranda Schreurs, who is the chair of Climate and Environmental Policy at the Technical University of Munich's Bavarian School of Public Policy, where she researches environmental movements, green politics, and climate policy. And today we'll be discussing Europe's rapid shift away from Russia as an energy supplier and its transition towards clean energy sources. We'll also be looking at who is driving these changes, what sort of new dependencies have emerged, and how Canada and Europe can manage political backlash as energy security becomes increasingly geopolitical. Dr. Schreurs, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Europe has notably shifted away from Russian energy sources. How would you describe Europe's transformation in its energy policies, and which changes have been most significant in your opinion?
Even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe was on a transformation path. So there were efforts to expand the use of renewable energy and to enhance energy efficiency. But Europe was very dependent on Russia for gas, for oil, and even for coal. So at the time of the invasion, Europe was getting as much as 40% of its gas from Russia, which is a lot if you think about how many industries are dependent on gas for their operations. And the same with oil and coal. So right after the invasion, because of the concerns about loss of sovereignty, an invasion of a sovereign nation, Europe said, this isn't right. We can't continue to depend so much on Russian energy. So overnight, in the first year of 2022, the invasion began in February. By the end of the year, Europe had already stopped importing coal, and it was reducing dramatically its imports of oil and gas. And within the next 2 to 3 years, there were contracts that needed to be fulfilled, so you couldn't just stop everything right away. But today, we've basically broken complete dependence on Russian oil and gas and coal, which has meant a huge transformation had to take place. And that transformation has different elements. Part of it was the expansion of incentives to put solar into rooftops or bigger scale solar along railroad tracks, for example. A lot of wind turbines. They take time to build. They're not as fast as solar, especially the offshore wind, but auctions for offshore wind. Where I live in Munich, they're pushing geothermal. And so big shift towards expanding renewables, but at the same time, some new dependencies.
Your work has emphasized the role of policy entrepreneurs who have taken the crisis in Ukraine as an opportunity to increase the speed of transitions and reforms regarding climate policy. So who have been the key actors who have been doing this on both the EU and national levels, and have they been successful in doing so?
There have been pushes coming both from states and from the European Commission. So in my state, for example, I live in Germany. One of the things we've seen is young people who have taken the German government to court and said, we expect a much more active climate policy. And the courts backed the young people and said, you're right, the German government needs to do more. So already before the invasion, this kind of push was happening. 2019, the German government had passed a climate law. Then we have this court case. And in 2021, we get a new climate law, which says instead of climate neutrality by 2050, it has to be by 2045. And we hear that interim targets need to be established so that we can get carbon neutral in the next 25 years. So part of this push is coming from really engaged young people. part of the push is also coming from, we had a government that came into power just as the war was beginning. It was a coalition of a conservative party and the Green Party, excuse me, and an economically liberal party. And especially with the Green Party in control of the economics ministry in Germany, there was a big push to say now's the time to expand renewables. Now's the time to pursue a circular economy so we don't have to import as much material, and when you import more and you produce everything new, you use more energy. So really thinking about every niche and cranny where you can save energy. And at the European Commission level, we had the same thing. The European Commission said Europe, for its own sovereignty, for its own well-being, we can't let ourselves get too dependent on other countries. So we saw for the first time in history where energy was being used in a really big way as a political, almost as a military weapon, right? We're going to cut off your gas and then your industry won't work. And we didn't want that kind of concern. So the European Commission established new targets and new incentive systems to speed up the buildup of renewables.
As Europe has decoupled from Russia's energy supplier, we've seen Russia turn towards China to deepen its ties as a way to circumvent sanctions on fossil fuels. How has this impacted Europe, and how concerned are you regarding Europe's growing dependencies on China as a supplier of clean energy technologies, as well as the critical minerals that are needed for such technology?
Good question, because you also don't want to shift dependency just from one to the next country and find yourself in the same situation some years down the road. Several things have been troubling for Europe. One is that we didn't get the full support of other countries with the sanctions on Russia. So China, for example, started to import some of the oil and the gas that Europe wasn't importing anymore. And the same with India. They were importing cheap oil and gas because Russia needed to find a way to get rid of it. And that strained our relations with these countries. At the same time, China is a very big greenhouse gas emitter. 30% of global CO2 emissions are Chinese. And that meant that we also need to work with China. You can't have good climate policies and programs if the biggest emitter isn't on board. So in some ways, we're actually quite happy and excited that China is pursuing this transition and pushing energy transformations in the direction of renewables. What's problematic is if you find that your own technologies don't have free entry into another market. And so whereas Europe used to be dominant in renewable technologies, you could say that today China's China's become dominant in those renewable technologies. Now what we see ourselves doing is trying to say, let's see if we can't establish new cooperative partnerships, but on an eye-to-eye level.
In your work on energy transition towards renewable sources, you've compared Canada and Germany quite comprehensively. Obviously, Germany was more impacted following the energy crisis after Russia had invaded Ukraine, but you've also researched the impact that federalism has and also the role that European Union climate legislation has. Could you please summarize your main findings when you've compared Germany and Canada in these instances?
Certainly. Actually, there's several similarities, but also differences. I think one of the similarities is you have several provinces here in Canada that are also quite progressive when it comes to environment and climate policy. And that's a little bit like in the European Union. Not every state is equally focused on environment and climate. Some of them are more worried about jobs for the middle class, or they're still trying to catch up economically. We have a state like Poland that has lots of coal and actually wants to use it. And you look at Canada, and you have Alberta, you have the tar sands, You have lots of oil and gas. So of course there's differences in how the different provinces in Canada or states in Europe think about transition. At the same time, it's in a way those differences are an opportunity, because you can find ways to complement each other's strengths and weaknesses, if you want to call them that. In the case of Canada, you have the advantage compared with Europe of having lots of natural resources, including some of those rare earth minerals that we need for an energy transition towards renewables. So if you can work with states together and say, well, we're not going to make the transformation in a year's time, it's going to take decades, let's plan it out so that we can rely on some of the oil and the gas and the renewable, the rare earth minerals that some provinces have, and use that to push forward the transition where we see it happening, like in Quebec or in Ontario. Same in Europe, except Europe doesn't have the rare earth minerals, and Europe doesn't have a lot of its oil and gas, so it needs to import from somewhere, or it needs to develop these resources itself. So where I think Europe maybe has an unusual advantage over Canada, Europe is more dependent on resources, and that means everything's expensive. And you're like, what do you mean that's an advantage? It pushes you forward to be more energy efficient. It makes you really think about where are the potentials for new technologies. How can we use a circular economy to recycle our materials and get the rare earth elements that we have in our computers, our cell phones, or inside some of our other equipment. So in that sense, there are advantages and disadvantages that Canada and the European Union have. But what I think both areas, what we have is a general understanding of the importance of environment and nature. And Canada has been a real leader in many ways internationally also on pursuing transformations and thinking about cultural differences. And I think that's something that's super important when we think not just about our own countries, but when we think globally, and how do we bring everybody along.
And to build off the last question, how can policymakers in both Canada and Germany overcome their fossil fuel legacies without triggering a massive political backlash and economic disruption?
The European Union is on its way to the renewable energy transition. So about half of electricity now is renewables based. But when you look at total energy, we're still using quite a lot of fossil fuels. So the transition that's happening in the European Union and Canada it's still in a beginning phase. We've done quite a bit. We're about 50% renewables now in the electricity system in Europe. Some Canadian provinces, because of your hydro, are also doing really well. But we still are very dependent for heating, for transportation on fossil fuels. So for the next decades, the real focus is going to have to be not just expanding renewables, it's going to have to be thinking about how do we take these buildings in Canada and make them more energy efficient. I can tell you the hotel I stayed in last night, it has the cold air just pumping in from outside into the building, and that's just too wasteful, right? We really need to think about how we're building our buildings so that we're using our energy more efficiently. Reduce demand, you save a lot on fossil fuels. And then you think about, well, could we even build our buildings differently? Because a lot of our energy is what we call gray energy. It's embedded in the building itself. But if we could construct with more materials that have been recycled, or even with new materials that aren't made with so much energy, then the demand for fossil fuels declines as well. But you also asked me, what does this mean for costs, right? How do we do it in such a way that the middle class doesn't feel like they're being left behind? If we don't have the middle class on board, we lose our democracies. So we also have to think about how to do this in a paced way so that the costs are spread across the different generations. And it's not just future generations that have to pay all the costs, but also today's generation. And then a last point here, I think it's also really important to think about where is economic competitiveness going to be in the future? If you want jobs in your country in the future, is it really just going to be in the fossil fuels? Or is it going to be in the development of new technologies and processes and materials and the use of artificial intelligence to make everything function more effectively? Where are you going to have more jobs? And I can guarantee you it's going to be in that technological area and not in the fossil fuels. So we need to show people that the transformation, yes, it will cost, but it'll cost less than if we don't do anything, and it'll take us into a cleaner and more exciting economic future.
And for our final question, you sort of mentioned earlier how following the invasion of Ukraine, we saw energy being weaponized as a tool for geopolitical ambitions. And it is obviously no secret that we currently live in a period of increased geopolitical tensions, which have been exacerbated by doubts on transatlantic relationships, which have been placed by the current American presidential administration. What role do you see such tensions having on energy policies in countries like Canada and also those in Europe?
I think it's particularly hard for Canada because you've got the United States on your southern border. And over the past 100 years, your export strategy has been to export resources to the United States or to have some of the production, like of automobiles, here in Canada. And suddenly you are hearing threats to Canadian sovereignty, and you're hearing about maybe Canada should be the 51st state, and of course that's not acceptable. So I think Canada is learning some of the same lessons that Europe started to learn with the Russian war on Ukraine, to say we need to be more diversified in our globalization. I think it's an opportunity for Canada and Europe to work more closely together, and the European Union's in the same boat. We're very dependent on the US for exports and for military security, and a lot of European investment is in the United States. And Europe has suddenly woken up and said, wow, we never expected it. Nobody could imagine these kinds of threats, that a territory that is under Danish control is being targeted by the United States. That's just, for Europeans, totally unacceptable, a real shock. And Europe, too, is now saying, well, we need to really diversify. And hence you see the rapid signing of the free trade agreement with Mercosur. You see a new free trade agreement with India. Here in Canada, you see the discussion about importing electric automobiles from China. And I think what we're seeing is over-dependence on any one country, unfortunately, seems to be a bit of a security risk these days.
Dr. Schreurs, thank you for your time and for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you so much.